In the early 90s, the video game arcade industry introduced the world to the fighting game phenomenon with the release of Street Fighter II in 1991. Its success would lead to many other video game companies releasing their own take on the fighting game. Street Fighter II's first big competitor was Mortal Kombat, a fighting game using digitized graphics that was released in 1992. While Street Fighter became popular for its speed and gameplay, Mortal Kombat caught on with players for its depiction of violence and gore. Over the next couple of years, these two different though successful fighting games would lead to numerous imitations from multiple game studios with their own interpretations on the fighting game genre. By 1994, Nintendo decided to take part in the current fighting game craze and enlisted the Stamper Brothers and their company Rareware to design a brand new fighting game for them. Having recently invested in Silicon Graphics workstations to design the video game Donkey Kong Country, they decided to use the same computer technology to develop this new fighting game. For this game, the team was led by designers at Rare who had previously worked on a number of games at the company. The two main designers behind this project were Chris Tilston and Kevin Bayliss. Mark Betteridge was the head programmer responsible for the game's engine. Martin Hollis served as the technical programmer, making him responsible for designing the tools for the game's effects. And Ken Lobb from Nintendo of America also contributed to the game's development and overall design. Their fighting game would come to be known as Killer Instinct, and it was released in arcades in October 1994. Using the power of their Silicon Graphics workstations, Rareware partnered with Midway, a US game publisher and arcade manufacturer, to develop the game's proprietary arcade hardware. Killer Instinct was the first arcade game to feature an internal hard disk drive. Unlike other arcade games at the time, its inclusion allowed each arcade cabinet to store large amounts of data, which enabled the game to feature full-motion video, more detailed graphics, and higher quality sound compared to its contemporaries. This arcade hardware, co-developed between Rare and Midway, was promoted as being the same hardware engine used to power Nintendo's successor to the Super Nintendo, which was currently only known as Ultra 64. The gameplay system was heavily influenced by other popular fighting games at the time. It had a 6-button control scheme and special moves similar to Street Fighter, as well as finishing moves for each character as seen in Mortal Kombat. At the same time, it also featured its own unique innovations to the fighting game formula. Typically in other fighting games, a single round would progress until one player's life bar was depleted, which would end the round and reset the stage. However, in Killer Instinct, each player had 2 full vitality bars at their disposal. If one player depletes their life bar in a round, the match would still resume, but the winning player would be able to keep his remaining health from a previous round. The main highlight in the game's fighting system was its automatic combo system. Along with pressing button combinations to perform special moves, players could also input a button combination that would allow their characters to unleash individual attacks at a faster succession, resulting in a string of hits to the opponent. This felt much different compared to other fighting games where combos were only formed by delivering individual attacks. Players were ranked for each combo based on the number of hits pulled off in one sequence, which would always be proclaimed by the game's infamous announcer, who was voiced by Chris Sutherland. For example, if a player could pull off a combo consisting of over 20 hits, the announcer would proclaim that the player has just pulled off an Ultra Combo. Ultra Combo! However, at any time, the receiver of a combo attack was able to break their opponent's combo with a move known as the Combo Breaker. Combo Breaker! In a nod to Mortal Kombat's fatality system, each character in Killer Instinct had finishing moves they could perform at the end of a match. Originally referred to as a No Mercy. Show no mercy. These finishing moves would later be known as danger moves. Danger, danger, danger. If the winner is unable to perform the specified button combination in the allotted time, the losing player could input their own button combinations to return to the match and one last chance for victory. Another finishing move players could perform was known as the humiliation moves. Humiliation! If players could win a match while maintaining their first bar of health, they could input a button combination that would force their opponent to do an awkward dance. The setting for Killer Instinct was nothing particularly special when it came to fighting games, but it served its purpose for setting up the game's universe. In the distant future, governments have been replaced by corporations, the most powerful of these being the megacorporation Ultratech. Under the guise of a tournament, Ultratech is able to test out their newfound technology, as well as a number of experimental creatures they have created. Each of the 11 playable characters in the game had a unique design and some kind of connection to this megacorporation. Fulgor is a prototype cybernetic soldier developed by Ultratech for possible mass production. Cinder is a criminal who participates in a chemical weapons research by Ultratech in exchange for an early release from prison. However, these experiments result in his body becoming entirely composed of fire, which he is then able to manipulate. Glacius is an alien from a distant planet who is captured by Ultratech. His body is composed of ice and water, which allows him to shapeshift into various forms. Jago is a Tibetan warrior monk who is on a quest for enlightenment. Riptor is a velociraptor-human hybrid that has been genetically engineered by Ultratech. Saberwolf is a man who has been stricken with lycanthropy, an ability that has transformed him into a werewolf. He is believed to be a reference to the character Saberman from Rare's 1984 game Saberwolf. Spinal is a reanimated skeleton that comes from the remains of an ancient warrior. TJ Combo is a former heavyweight boxing champion with cybernetic implants in his arms. Chief Thunder is a Native American armed with tomahawks who enters the tournament in search of his long-lost brother. And finally, Black Orchid is a secretary of Ultratech who is actually an undercover spy working for an unknown party. At the end of the tournament, players would face off against Idol, a two-headed ancient mystical warlord from another dimension that has been captured by Ultratech. While he lacked many of the special moves the other characters had, he is the only character who has the ability to heal himself. Once Killer Instinct was released in arcades, the game became incredibly popular among fighting game fans. Many players were impressed by the game's cutting-edge visuals and fast-paced gameplay. The game's stylish attack animations and gameplay mechanics came off as something new and advanced for its time. Meanwhile, others criticized the game for relying too heavily on button memorizations and how the game's finishing moves, a clear imitation of Mortal Kombat, were neither as violent nor memorable by comparison. Still, fans who enjoyed the game loved Killer Instinct because of its own take on over-the-top action and how it never took itself really seriously. For instance, one of the key moments most people remember from the game, other than its combo system, was a finishing move done by Black Orchid where she casually unzips her uniform's top and flashes her breasts at her opponent, giving them a heart attack. Unless when done to herself, which just makes her opponent upset. These bits of humor were seen throughout the game with each of the characters. Another example would be when Spinal decides to pursue a career in Hollywood following his victory, or when Idol encounters his supposedly long-lost mother in a similar fashion to a character from another fighting game, although with slightly different results. As beloved as Killer Instinct and its characters became, something else that caught people's attention and became just as memorable was the game's soundtrack. The music for the game was composed by two of the new in-house composers at Rare, Robin Beanland and Graham Norgett. The soundtrack had a range of dance, techno, and rock music that resulted in many catchy and upbeat tunes. There was even further excitement for Killer Instinct among players because the game's graphics were believed to be a demonstration of the graphical capabilities of Nintendo's 64-bit console, then known only as the Ultra 64. In fact, Killer Instinct was originally intended to be released on the Nintendo 64 in 1995. However, Nintendo chose to delay the system, so Rareware chose to instead release the game on the Super Nintendo. While Midway helped Rare publish the arcade game, Nintendo was responsible for publishing the game on their home console. Leading up to the game's console release, Nintendo promoted the game heavily at E3 in 1995, where they featured many of the designers behind the game at Nintendo and Rare, as well as had a group of female dancers who would regularly perform in front of the game's booth. Killer Instinct was ported to the Super Nintendo in August 1995. With the decision to port the game to the Super Nintendo instead of the Nintendo 64, many of the features in the arcade version had to be changed, reduced, or removed completely. The character sprites became smaller and the 3D panning camera was changed to a 2D camera, though Rare was able to take advantage of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 rendering capability. The full motion videos featured in the arcade version were replaced with still images, plus many of the graphical details and voice samples for the characters were either reduced or taken out completely. While many of Killer Instinct's visual and audio features were hampered on the Super Nintendo, Rareware compensated for this by adding additional multiplayer modes and a training mode for players to enjoy. The Super Nintendo version of Killer Instinct was packaged in a black cartridge instead of the usual gray shell seen with other Super Nintendo games. Also, as an added bonus, each copy of the game was packaged with a soundtrack titled Killer Cuts, which featured 16 arranged tracks from the game. Despite the downgraded version of the game players received on the Super Nintendo, Killer Instinct still proved to be an incredible success for Rare and Nintendo. By November 1995, Rare and Nintendo also ported Killer Instinct to the Game Boy. The game was altered even further due to the system's limitations, and neither Cinder nor Riptor were playable in the game. With its limited control scheme and heavy alterations to the gameplay system, the Game Boy version of Killer Instinct was not as well received among fans. Still, Rare and Nintendo regarded Killer Instinct as a hit following its success in the arcades and the Super Nintendo. It wasn't long before fans wanted more from the franchise, so Rareware quickly began work on a true follow-up to their new popular fighting game. In 1996, Rare released the sequel to Killer Instinct with Killer Instinct 2. Robin Beanland returned and composed a brand new epic soundtrack that proved to be just as memorable as the one featured in the first game. The game built upon many of the foundations established with the first Killer Instinct while also making dramatic changes to the gameplay system. Each returning character received different movesets and new special moves. Throw moves were added to deal with blocking characters, and parry moves allowed for a new method for players to counterattack their opponent. The addition of a super bar, which would fill as the character took damage, allowed players to perform a multi-hit super move. Combo attacks became much easier to perform and more customizable, with the ability to perform either automatic or manual combos and include super moves as well. The way players would execute combo breakers and finishing moves in the game were also noticeably changed. Combo breakers could now be executed with a corresponding special move, and finishing moves had to be done while the opponent still has a sliver of health remaining in the second round. For Killer Instinct 2, all the returning characters received new sprites and animations. Stage backgrounds were now rendered using full-motion video graphics. The setting for the game begins where the first Killer Instinct left off. After Black Orchid manages to kill Idol at the end of the tournament, a time warp is accidentally set off which sends many of the combatants 2,000 years into the past. With his death, the Demon Lord Gargos manages to escape from Limbo and continues his reign of evil. While Cinder, Chief Thunder, and Riptor do not make a return in Killer Instinct 2, the returning cast is joined by 3 new characters who are inhabitants of this past world that was once oppressed by Gargos. Maya is an Amazonian warrior who was responsible for previously banishing Gargos, Tusk is a fearless barbarian who seeks to destroy Gargos, and Kim Woo is an Eastern martial artist who is a descendant from a clan who previously defeated Idol and Gargos. Gargos, a large gargoyle and former rival of the warlord Idol, served as the final boss in the game and came with advantages similar to Idol, such as the ability to heal himself. Another new addition to Killer Instinct 2 was how each character could receive a different ending at the end of the game. After players managed to defeat Gargos, they can receive one of many endings depending on how they had defeated a certain character during the course of the game. Despite all the new additions and changes introduced in Killer Instinct 2, it wasn't able to either match or surpass the success had with the first game. People who had grown indifferent to the series were unmoved by the sequel. Meanwhile, fans of the original found themselves divided when it came to Killer Instinct 2. While some of them loved the new changes in the game and felt it was superior to the original, others felt that many of the changes made were not for the better. They either considered the new gameplay system to be flawed or didn't like how many of their characters' movesets were so drastically changed. Leading up to the sequel's console release, in early 1996, Rare partnered with comic book publisher Armada to produce a special Killer Instinct comic that was released exclusively with Nintendo Power magazine. The comic book expanded the fiction behind the game's universe by focusing on the backstories for many of the characters in the first Killer Instinct. 6 more volumes of this comic book series were published by Armada and Acclaimed Comics throughout the rest of the year, leading into the aftermath of the first game, which would then be continued in Killer Instinct 2. Not long after Killer Instinct 2 was released in arcades, Nintendo had officially launched their 64-bit console, the Nintendo 64. Killer Instinct 2 was ported to the Nintendo 64 as Killer Instinct Gold on November 1996, shortly after the launch of the console itself. While a port of Killer Instinct 2 to this new system was inevitable, the game would have to be dramatically changed, just like the first game, due to the Nintendo 64's memory limitations. The multiple endings for each character that was seen in the arcade version had to be removed. The full-motion videos were again replaced by still images, except when it came to the stage backgrounds, which were now fully rendered in 3D. The animation of character sprites were reduced, as well as voice samples for the characters and the announcer. Once again, Rare added a number of new features for the console release, such as different multiplayer modes, training modes, and unlockable content in the form of new stages and alternate color palettes for characters. After Killer Instinct 2 was released and failed to garner new fans to the series, other big fighting games that were released around the same time appeared to evolve past the mechanics established by Killer Instinct. This made Rare's fighting game franchise begin to already appear more antiquated compared to their contemporaries instead of the leading innovator. Despite all this, in 1998, Chris Tilston and a small team at Rare began to work on a prototype for Killer Instinct 3. It was planned to be in full 3D and come to the Nintendo 64. However, a group of designers from another team at Rare that had just started work on a game called Perfect Dark abruptly left the company. So rather than seeing Perfect Dark get scrapped and its team fall to pieces, the Killer Instinct 3 team stopped working on their game and went to work on Perfect Dark instead, thus resulting in the premature death of Killer Instinct 3. As more console generations came and went, people heard less and less about Killer Instinct from Rare. After the company joined Microsoft in 2002, fans thought it may be possible that Rare could bring back some of their older popular franchises like Killer Instinct onto Microsoft's consoles. Still, there was no official word on Rare making a return to the fighting game genre. When Microsoft transitioned from the Xbox to the Xbox 360, there was still no news of a follow-up to Killer Instinct 2, let alone a remake. By 2007, rumors that Rare was planning to release Killer Instinct 3 began to spread across the internet. Then there were rumors that the first 2 Killer Instinct games could make a return through the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console. In the middle of 2008, a new rumor spread that claimed Rare was working on a new Killer Instinct for the Xbox 360, tentatively titled Killer Instinct 3D: Death, Destruction, and Doom. This game would supposedly drop the gameplay mechanics from past games in favor of a more refined combat system, and while the game supposedly still looked rather early, what had been seen was promising. But time passed and there were no more updates on that rumor. A few months later, another rumor began to spread that Killer Instinct would be coming to Xbox Live Arcade. The port of the game would be coming from a third-party developer and not directly from Rare. A few more months later, the website Mundo Rare was reportedly contacted by someone at Microsoft and sent a music sheet which contained the main title theme for Killer Instinct 3. Shortly after this was released, film and television composer Chris Tilton arranged a piece of music based on the sheets. While the music produced did not match the classic Killer Instinct theme, it was definitely a constructed theme. But the question of whether or not this came from a third Killer Instinct game still remained unanswered. By the end of that month, in an interview with MTV Multiplayer, Greg Mayles of Rare said that the company wouldn't consider resurrecting a franchise like Killer Instinct unless they came up with some revolutionary idea for a new fighting game. To him, the notion of bringing back an old franchise like Killer Instinct simply for the sake of a small but vocal minority of die-hard fans was not how they wanted to approach it. By November of 2008, Mark Betteridge of Rare admitted in an interview that Killer Instinct had been a franchise that was once a candidate for revival. He stated how he personally wanted to see Killer Instinct remade for the Xbox 360 as a downloadable game, but if they were to introduce a new Killer Instinct, it would have to be something completely new and feature different characters instead of simply reintroducing the original cast. To him, the only problem was that introducing something as complex as the series combo system to newcomers would be something difficult to present without resulting in a smaller user base. Still, he believes that if a revolution were to be found within the fighting game genre, it could just be what they need to kickstart the franchise once again. Otherwise, the market would just remain stagnant and result in diminishing returns. Recently, the fighting game market received a sort of reinvigoration with the release of Street Fighter IV and the so-called revival of Mortal Kombat, both of which harken back to the old days of arcade gaming. With the relaunches of these two fighting game franchises, a spark ignited once again for those who have held out for Killer Instinct's return. Granted, it could also be said that the fanbase behind Killer Instinct were never as large in numbers as either Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. Yet those who fondly remember the series believe that the innovations originally established in Killer Instinct can still be seen in many of the new fighting games on the market. Even though Killer Instinct only received 2 official titles from Rare, it was enough to leave a lasting impact on those who once played it back in the day. While some felt that the games appeared to already show their age by the second game, those few who still find time to play Killer Instinct have proven that not only does Killer Instinct remain incredibly compelling, but also genuinely timeless. Whether it comes from its still unique over-the-top action, colorful cast of characters, or its memorable epic soundtracks, the experience of Killer Instinct continues to live on in the minds and hearts of its devoted fans.
Awesome victory! Perfect!
Next time, in part 4 of this Rare Retrospective, Rare creates a video game based on a new James Bond film in the first-person shooter genre. Even though it would be the first time Rare had created such a game, it would prove to be not only the most influential game they ever made, but one of the most important games in the company's entire history.